Good evening, class. This is going to be a short lecture on the Renaissance. Now, unlike your book, which concentrates on many of the political and economic changes that had happened during the Renaissance era, in looking over your textbook, we pretty much went over a lot of these things in talking about the late Middle Ages. So one of the things that I want to tell you up front is this lecture is going to be a little bit more, hopefully, interesting in that we're going to deal mainly with art, because that is what the Renaissance is noted for, the change in art. And so one of the questions that I want to put to you guys, actually there's two questions. The first one is, why does the Renaissance occur, when it does and where it does? And then secondly, why is the change in art and scholarship and thinking, how does art affect these things? How does art play a role in the development of society and become historically significant? Now, what does the Renaissance mean? What was the Renaissance? Well, in short, the Renaissance has its origins in Italy. The reason why the Renaissance takes place where it does is because of the change, the economic change that Europe is undergoing in the late Middle Ages. Now, as we talked about in the last lecture on the late Middle Ages, actually the lecture before the last lecture, but the lecture on the Middle Ages, we talk about the birth of the commercial economy, of the cash economy. And we see this development, there's nowhere else in Europe that we don't see this more clearly than in the northern Italian city-states. Now, if you turn in your book to page 348, there's a map in the very top part of the page, and you can see this much more clearly than the really piss poor little picture I've got right here. But in these northern Italian cities, they are commercial. They are dominated by merchant families. They are wealthy, and as wealthy societies, they will develop into major trading centers and urban centers. And as we will see in our discussion, this wealth that is gained through commercial activity rather than through the old feudal system will cause art and society to start to move away from being solely centered around the church. And instead, you start to see society becoming more focused on material aspects of life, enjoying life, and what we often call in history and just scholarship secularism. Now, the Renaissance, as you can probably guess if you've been reading the book, is not a clean break from the medieval period. The fall of Rome was a nice clean break. Rome collapsed, and then you have the Middle Ages. But in the Renaissance, certain areas of Europe are going to undergo the Renaissance, like in the northern Italian city-states, well before the rest of Europe will be affected by the Renaissance. So much of the time period that we're going to be discussing today is still in the late 1300s, 1400s, before the Renaissance spreads to the rest of Europe. Now, Renaissance is a term coined by Renaissance thinkers. It basically means rebirth, as Europe recovered from what Renaissance thinkers considered a Dark Age. Now today, and what we used in class, Dark Ages meant, for us, it meant the time period immediately after the fall of Rome. But for Renaissance thinkers, the entire medieval period, from the fall of Rome in the 400s all the way up to the 13 and 1400s, were the Dark Ages. And so These Renaissance thinkers believe that the Renaissance is regaining Europe's place in the world back to the same level that Europe enjoyed during the height of Rome. Now, where does the Renaissance actually come from? Well, again, the Crusades play a major role in the evolution away from the medieval feudalistic society to a more modern society. That's what the Renaissance is all about, shifting away from feudalism toward a society that we would more recognize today. And the way the Crusades helped, well, number one, they increased demand for Middle Eastern and Far Eastern goods. This, of course, stimulated trade with foreign markets. It gave those European commercial routes that had been long since dormant after the fall of Rome the reason to become renewed, to come back to the fore. And so Europe has a rebirth in trade and commerce. And of course, with this rebirth in trade and commerce, gives encouragement for the use of credit and banking. As we will see, the most powerful people that helped fund the Renaissance, all of these artists did not just paint these great works of art just for their own consumption. They were paid to make these pieces of art. And one way that these merchant families became so incredibly stinking rich, to use a modern phrase, is by loaning money to other merchants, but especially European rulers. They even loaned money to the church. Now, why do we see this development of credit and banking? Well, as we've already talked about in previous lectures, men who are leaving France, England, and other places in Western Europe, and heading to the Holy Land, they can't put their land in their back pocket. They need some way to buy goods and services along the way. So they go to their merchants from their homelands, say France, for example, and they say, hey, you trade with people in these areas that I'm going to be marching through. Give me an IOU. Give me credit. I'm good for it. If I don't make it back, my family will pay off my debt. They'll pay it off in the production of my lands. And so these crusaders march off to the Holy Land with something that we would find familiar today, paper money. It's not government-issued paper money, but it is a letter of credit. And as more and more individuals, nobles, commoners, craftsmen, and other merchants use these letters of credit, there needs to be some way of keeping track of this, of storing it, of trading it. This is what banking is the transfer, trade, accumulation, storing, and investing of money. That's all money is. Money is a letter of credit. It has no intrinsic value in and of itself. Now, another thing that allowed the growth in banking in Europe during this time period is a change in the church rules against banking. Because you don't go into banking just to loan money. You don't just go into banking. People don't make money in banking by loaning out $10 and then taking back in $10. The money is in the interest. Now, originally, the Catholic Church stated that this charging of interest was a sin called usury. You're basically taking advantage of people. According to the traditional definition of usury, to charge interest is to basically steal. However, by the 1300s, the church had revised its view of usury. Instead of a sin of charging interest, usury is now considered the sin of charging excessive interest. Loan sharking, if you will. And of course, this will open the door to more and more merchants to become bankers. Now, these letters of credit will act as a money supply and expedite trade. And one of the cool things that many of us don't realize is European contact with the Arab world will actually facilitate the growth of banking, because before the Crusades, Europeans still used Roman numerals, XVII. Now, there's a problem with Roman numerals when it comes to bookkeeping for merchants and banking. First, as we all know, it's incredibly hard to add, subtract, and multiply those things. Arabic numerals are based on a base of 10, 1 through 10. And they also have the concept of zero, the goose egg. In Roman numerals, there is no such thing as a zero. Now think about this. How would our world work today if you had no concept, or I shouldn't say concept, but no practice of using zero in your accounting and bookkeeping? There's no way of recording that this is a zero balance, that I have zero inventory. You're going, these people actually had this kind of practice? Yes, they did. It's not until the adoption of Arabic numerals, not until then, that Europeans have the old zero. And all of these effects of the crusade will help lead not only to the expansion of trade, the accumulation of wealth, but finally to the Renaissance. Now, when we talk about Italy, just as you see in the book on page 348, Italy is not a unified country. Instead, it is a conglomeration of smaller kingdoms. In the south, you have the Kingdom of Naples. Around Rome, you have the Papal States. These are political units that are ruled directly by the church. But in the north, you have the city-states of Milan, Venice, Genoa, and Florence. These are commercial city-states that dominate the trade of the Western Mediterranean. Now, Milan is one of the richest cities because, as you can see here, it sits at the headwaters of a river that leads to the Adriatic. This means that Milan is perfectly situated not only to receive trade from the ocean, but be the doorway in which those assets, those valuable items, make their transit from Italy into France. Venice sits, of course, at the mouth of the exact same river. And so that trade is going through Venice. Genoa, being on the other side of the Italian boot, dominates the trade into the Riviera in southern France. But however, one of the most powerful of these Italian city-states is Florence. And Florence is dominated by the Dominici family. Now, the Dominici family they're not a noble family. They are commoners. They are merchants. However, they are incredibly rich and they are incredibly powerful. As we will see, it is the Dominici family that will fund many of the Renaissance artists that we talk about today. Now, Renaissance art can illustrate changing social values. This is why we look at art in history many times. Because art, writing, poetry, these artistic values show current social values. Case in point, here we have 4 paintings. 2 are from the medieval period. 2 are from the Renaissance era. One is of a Byzantine emperor. One is of a pope. And the 2 in the middle are of the mother of Jesus, the Virgin Mary. Now let's look at the ones on the left. We see the Byzantine emperor sitting on his throne, holding the globe and scepter of power. He sits up rigidly, flanked by advisors, showing the power of the Byzantine Empire. Likewise, the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus here, they seem to hover over the throne. Jesus, of course, has a halo, and they're flanked by angels with halos. Below them are the saints. Over on the right, we see a pope. I believe this is Pope Julius. How would you describe him? Is he a symbol of power, of stability? While he wears the papal robe, this is more personal. It's more realistic. But in being more realistic, it shows the frailty of an old man. It shows that this office has been a heavy weight on his shoulder, and that he is not an infallible ruler like we see of the Byzantine emperor here in the medieval period. But he's human. And likewise, the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus. There are no angels. There is no sense of hovering above space. Instead, it is a realistic depiction of a mother and child. The Virgin Mary could be any woman, and the baby Jesus is being a rambunctious kid. So we see social values changing away from a deference to authority and a belief in the sanctity and infallibility of both religious icons and worldly leaders. Now we're going to look at several of the major Renaissance artists. The four that we're going to look at are the four of the most famous ones: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello. And no, these are not the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. They're not the only Renaissance artists, though. Your book actually goes into several others, but we just don't have time to basically go from every artist that comes out of the Italian Renaissance. But one of the things that they all share is that these artists use a technique known as linear perspective. This is best illustrated by Raphael's school of Socrates. Let's see here. It's on page... Yes, on page 362. It is... Actually, I gave it the wrong title. It is The School at Athens. And you can see, by using lines, how you draw the picture, you can literally pull in the focus of the viewer. And with this picture, you can pull in the eye, the perspective of the viewer to the two main characters, and of course the center one is Socrates here. He's the one on the left. They also use the techniques of shading, curvatures, and realistic values in order to create a three-dimensional, lifelike picture. Because life is not perfect. Life shows reality instead. So let's look at this evolution. Starting out with Donatello. Donatello is one of the first of the great Renaissance artists. Now, Donatello's full name is Donatello de Niccolo de Betti de Bardi. However, he is most noted for his, of course, Donatello. Now, he is from Florence. He made his living by designing and constructing art, as you see here on the right. Classical monuments to men like this. This is a member of the De Medici family right here, who was one of Donatello's patrons. However, Donatello is best noted for his cutting-edge avant-garde art as illustrated by his version of David. Because in this art, Donatello uses human anatomy to not only make a lifelike image of the young David, but to basically push the boundaries of what was acceptable. It was considered taboo before this time to show nudity, especially genitalia. It was also considered taboo to use nude models, in which Donatello was famous for using. Now, Donatello is not only noted for his art, he is also noted for his life. Donatello was more than likely bisexual, at least, and maybe even homosexual. However, Donatello is able to live at this time relatively unmolested by the church or secular authorities because he had the protection of the secular authorities. As I stated before, he had the patronage of the powerful De Medici family. Now, a close contemporary of Donatello, a man who would also make his own David, is Michelangelo, whose real name is Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simone. And he lived between 1475 and 1564. Now, Michelangelo, like Donatello, was both a painter and a sculptor. Now, Michelangelo is interesting not only because he follows in Donatello's footsteps of using nudes and making nude artwork, but he also illustrates the growing power of artists. This is best illustrated by his seminal work here, the Sistine Chapel. This is a picture as if you were lying on the floor looking up at the top of the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel was built in the early 1500s. In 1505, Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to build a tomb for Julius II. About the same time, the Pope also asked Michelangelo to paint the fresco, the central fresco on the ceiling of the new Sistine Chapel. Now this is where it gets interesting, because originally the Pope wanted just one central fresco, nothing more. However, Michelangelo, to put it bluntly, went wild. He exerted his own authority and started painting these various frescoes showing the downfall of man in the Garden of Eden, the salvation, and the genealogy of Christ. On two separate occasions, the Pope fired Michelangelo because he was basically superseding his orders and also charging more money. The problem was, after basically giving Michelangelo his walking papers, the Pope could not get any other artist to complete the Sistine Chapel's ceiling. So the Pope had to come back to Michelangelo and allow him to complete one of the greatest artworks in the modern era. Now, another Italian Renaissance artist that pioneers realistic artwork is Raffaello Sanzino di Urbino, otherwise known as Raphael. Now, Raphael is interesting in that, on the one hand, he is one of the pioneering artists that uses shading and form to create three-dimensional images. But like Donatello, it is Raphael's private life that is also illustrative of this change. Raphael was noted for, well, let's just put it this way, he was a player. He was the ladies' man of Rome and Florence. Let's see, was it Florence? I believe it was. And actually he died fairly young. As you can see, he died in his 30s. And according to contemporary accounts, on his 37th birthday, Raphael basically went out and partied with his longtime girlfriend, Lute. And after a night of excessive sex, fell into a fever and died shortly thereafter. Again, it is the fact that he had strong patrons that allowed Raphael to basically flaunt his vice, his sin, if you will. Now, the artist that is best remembered as a Renaissance man is Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci who was not only an artist, but he was a painter, a sculptor, a musician, an early engineer. This is a man who had such broad interest that Renaissance man comes to be equated with a man who is good at everything. Now, like his close contemporaries, Leonardo uses light, shading, three-dimensionality to not only create realistic art, but to make the viewer, make the person looking at the art, question what's going on. Classic example is the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is one of the first pictures of a person actually smiling. And many people ask the question, why is this woman smiling? Did somebody just tell a joke? What? What is this woman smiling about? Another example of Leonardo making the viewer question his artwork is The Last Supper. This has become such a interesting picture that it's actually the basis of the books like the Da Vinci Code. Because the question that many people are asking is Leonardo da Vinci basically challenging the church's view of Jesus? Because the traditional Catholic view of Jesus is that he was born, he grew up, he ministered and proselytized and created the Christian religion, and then was crucified. It makes no mention that he had a wife or a family. Now, Jesus more than likely was crucified sometime in his 30s. According to Jewish tradition, he should have already had a wife. And many people argue that Leonardo was actually making the statement that Jesus may have had a wife. Because if you look at the Last Supper, let me get my arrow back here. We have the 12 disciples. We have Judas here, who is one of the youngest, saying, "No, my Lord, I will not betray you." However, the most important position is on Jesus' right hand, so it would be on the left side of this picture. So who is sitting here on the right of Jesus? Well, according to the traditional view, it's Peter, the man who will become the very first Pope of Rome. However, if you look closely at this figure is very petite, diminutive, and unlike almost every other one of the disciples, who has facial hair. This one does not. So the question becomes, is this Peter or is this Mary Magdalene? The woman that Jesus was one of the first women Jesus saved. She was a prostitute. Did Jesus take a wife? Well, maybe Leonardo da Vinci is actually making that statement, which at the time would have been incredibly controversial and would have been tantamount to heresy. Now, besides challenging, at least through his art, the dogma of the church, Leonardo da Vinci also was at the vanguard of scientific development during this time period. His notebooks show a mind that was tireless in its questioning of things like human anatomy, weaponry, and, of course, artistry. And for this reason, Leonardo da Vinci, who we see here in a self-portrait, right here in the center, was a man that many people believed foreshadowed the modern world, because it is Leonardo da Vinci in his notebooks, he drew drawings of what appear to be crude helicopters, airplanes, tanks, that this is a man that was only limited by the technology of the era, that if he had had access to more modern technology, many of his drawings would have been practical and feasible. Of course, we have another one of Leonardo's classic designs of human anatomy. Now, the humanists. Who are the humanists? Because not all Renaissance artists are painters and sculptors. Instead, the Renaissance spawns a new intellectual movement. This intellectual movement is a product of medieval scholasticism. This is an intellectual movement of the High and Late Middle Ages that stresses learning and scholarship. So many of the earliest humanists are scholars in the new universities that are developing in Europe during the 13 and 1400s. Now, one thing that I need to point out is that at this time, the humanists of the Renaissance period, I'll call them classical humanists, still are people who believe in God, unlike secular humanists today, who many of them, or most of them, are atheists. Classical humanists do not have a problem with religion. Instead, they have a problem with the church and dogma. These classical humanists scorned the dense writing style of medieval theologians and instead hearkened back to the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Cato, these Greek and Roman philosophers and scholars. They basically borrow heavily from them in reinterpreting and making Christianity relevant to the modern age. However, in looking at classical Greek and Roman writing, many of these humanists will start to look at the secular world rather than focusing upon religion and theology. Now, the interesting thing about the humanists is that these are individuals that are not outside of the church. Some of the most noted humanists of the era are clergy. Pope Pius II and, excuse me, my computer is not fully plugged up, so I need to plug it back in. You get to see my computer telling me that it's about to run out of power. Some of the most noted humanists are leaders of the Catholic Church, Pope Pius II and Leo X. On the one hand, will be patrons of humanist writings. These people will basically order or commission church scholars and university scholars to investigate the world using this new outlook. Now, one of the best known of the humanists of this era is Francisco Petrarca, or Petrarch. Petrarch was an Italian scholar and poet. Now, one of the things that sets Petrarch apart is that while being a good Christian, Petrarch argued that, well, to put it bluntly, the world needs tolerance. Petrarch argued that the only way to have intellectual discourse and progress and learning is for the church to allow dissenting views, to allow people to voice their opinion without fear of excommunication or being burned at the stake. Now, while humanists like Petrarch are dealing with church-state relations, there are few humanists that are concentrating almost solely on secular matters. The most noted one of these is Niccolo Machiavelli. Now, Machiavelli was what you might call a man of several gifts. He was a Renaissance man. He was a diplomat, a civil servant. Living in Florence, he helped organize the Florentine militia to reform their civil service. And while working for Florence, he basically condenses down all of what he has learned serving in government into a set of simple rules for rulers to follow, for princes to follow. In short, Machiavelli believes that the only way a ruler can stay in power and continue to rule is to concentrate solely on power. Because he argues that even men of principle are still men, as he points out from this quote that I have on the screen. Men are ungrateful, liars, deceivers, and they shun danger and greedy for profit. So according to Machiavelli, it is better for a ruler to be feared than loved, because love, according to Machiavelli, does not motivate people powerfully enough to supersede their own self-interest. Love has to be incredibly strong for somebody to risk their life. However, if they fear losing their life, that is a much greater motivation. A ruler should be quick and decisive in decision-making. They should not be seen as weak. Now, this is one of the more famous ones of Machiavelli. A ruler has to keep power by any means necessary. If it means being moral and godly, so be it. But if you maintain power by being brutal, so be it as well. Because the end justifies the means. The end is power. And if you get however you get there is irrelevant as long as you maintain power. And then finally, be good when possible, evil when necessary. Now, these simple rules that he expounds upon and clarifies and explains in greater detail in his classic work, The Prince. And actually, The Prince is not that big. Hold on a minute. Because I actually have a copy of it here. I have my own copy. And if we look at the Prince, because, let's see here, this book actually has 2 books in it. This is The Prince. So from page 1 to page 98, that's it. Because what Machiavelli is doing is he's literally cooking down all the things that he has learned as a civil servant into a guidebook, a playbook for rulers desiring to maximize their power. Now, the interesting thing about the Renaissance is that it starts in Italy in the late 1300s and going through the 1400s. However, like a contagion, the Renaissance will spread out from Italy and take over the rest of Europe. We see this in the works of Jan van Eyck. He is a Dutch author who lived between 1390 and 1441. We can see how many of the characteristics of Renaissance art are combined with traditional art, because many people argue that the artwork of Northern Europe is different from the artwork of the Italian masters, in that Northern European masters concentrated on emotional and devotional subjects. In this case, we see husband and wife. Now, you also have humanist thinkers. One of the most noted ones is a fellow that goes by the pen name of Erasmus. Erasmus, like Petrarch, argued for religious tolerance. He also argued that the only way for Christianity to be fully accepting of people is that individuals, even commoners and peasants, must be able to read and understand the Bible. You're going, okay, so what? I've got a Bible at home. Giving the power of the Word to the common man is incredibly radical at this time. At this time, the Bible is only in one language for the most part, Latin. Latin is a dead language by the 1300s. The only people who speak it are scholars and clergy. So Erasmus argues that the Bible needs to be translated into the vernacular. What does it mean, being translated into the vernacular? It means being translated into the native tongues of whoever is reading it. So in France, it needs to be in French. In Italy, it needs to be in Italian. In England, it needs to be in English. It needs to be accessible. In England, for example, we also see this Renaissance humanist movement. We see this in the writings of Sir Thomas More around 1516. Sir Thomas More is interesting in that, as we will see in a later lecture, he will play a crucial role in the English Reformation. However, before the Reformation, he is a political philosopher and theologian. And in his work, Utopia, he argues that the only way for a utopian society to be constructed is for men and women to disavow social status and disavow materialistic gain. Now, this desire for learning, this desire for people to be able to take part in the discourse that's coming out of the Renaissance will lead to the invention of a revolutionary device. This, of course, is the printing press. We see one of the very first printing presses right down here at the bottom of the screen. Come on, if this will work. Now, the very first printing press was developed by a fellow by the name of Gutenberg. Gutenberg was a German who wanted to print Bibles so that these Bibles would be accessible to the population. But the printing press is far more revolutionary than just making Bibles accessible to the population. Because think about this, if you can print Bibles, you can print anything else. You can print political pamphlets. You can print dissenting views. So this Renaissance development is incredibly important. And many of you have probably seen or read or watched a movie adaptation of someone affected by the Renaissance. Because many people argue that Geoffrey Chaucer, the English author of the Canterbury Tales, was heavily influenced by the Renaissance. Miguel de Cervantes, who wrote Don Quixote in Spain, was a Renaissance artist and writer. And then finally, one of the most noted writers and playwrights of the era, William Shakespeare, was more than likely affected by the changes going on in the Renaissance. Because these authors have one thing in common. If you look at the Canterbury Tales, or Don Quixote, or Shakespeare, almost every one of these works is challenging the society around them. Because the Renaissance, at its heart, was challenging not only artistic norms, but social and religious norms as well. These artists that we've went over today, and that you can read about in your book, are rebels, not only in their artwork, but in how they live their lives. So this spirit of quiet rebellion, of challenging social norms, accepted ideas, is key to understanding the social changes like the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and the Enlightenment that will follow it. So I want you guys to think about this for our next class discussion. I apologize that this lecture has not been very cohesive. Right now I have a pretty bad headache, and so I'm not thinking with probably all of my neurons. And I've also lectured for 4 hours straight today, so my voice is somewhat cracking. So I will see you guys later. Have a good weekend, and I will see you on Monday.